So what kind of stories are the nations writing? How about China? What kind of story are they writing? What about North Korea? Iran? What about Russia? You see, when you're ruled by fear, by deceivers, liars, autocrats, psychopaths, and sociopaths, they rule in darkness and they write very dark stories. And those dark stories are filled with fear and terror, suffering, death, and destruction. That has been most of human history, has it not been? If you live in fear, remember what I call fear? False evidence appearing real. It deceives you into enslaving you. And it gives you more of itself, making you more fearful of more things, more of the time. It rules you like a dictator, like a tyrant. And it demands that you become a proxy to it. And write even more destructive passages in your own life and the lives of others. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. If you're living your life only for your book cover, you don't know who you are. And if you don't know who you truly are, because you're focused only on the book cover, how can you actually play the role and write the story that you're supposed to? You can't. Stories are all around us. Everything is made of a story. Everything has a story. It's how we learn. It's how we grow. It's how we communicate. It's why we communicate. We live and breathe inside of a grand meta story, a grand meta narrative. The elements of that story, the environment where that story takes place, is everywhere around you. The characters in your story, just like you being characters in other stories, are your interactions, your relationships, how you deal with one another, how you communicate with one another, how you treat one another, what you believe, what you put your faith in, whom and what you trust. Stories are about relationships. After all, that is why God created creation and created you. relationship. And all of history is a story about that relationship, individually and collectively. How can you build any authentic and real relationship without truth? You can't. Because if you build anything on anything but truth, you're writing a story of fiction, and fiction is not true. So how can you build a relationship with somebody that's real if you're living a lie? And if you're living a lie, you're engaged in false evidence appearing real, meaning you're a deceiver. You're deceiving yourself and you're deceiving others. You're living only from the book covers and for the book cover. You judge everything by external appearances, by the book cover. And you wonder why your world is the way it is. Because your book cover is your flesh, your carnal mind. It is temporal. It is temporary. It's what is inside the book that has eternal and I do mean eternal consequences. It is what outlasts the book cover. The story lasts beyond the binding of the book covers. In fact, everybody is offered a never-ending story beyond the definitive beginning and end of their temporal one. But most people choose to live only for the book covers. And so they live in the shallows of reality and write works of fiction more than they write anything that is authentic, that is genuine, that is real. When a nation does such a thing, it doesn't have a very long shelf life in the library of time. And it always writes a work of fiction that turns out to be a tragedy filled with a comedy of errors. You can't write an eternal story with temporal means, methods, and language. Everything in the temporal, as I said, has a definitive beginning and a definitive end. But what you find when you exit the temporal is that is merely a chapter in an eternal story that goes on long after you've left the definitive temporal storybook. But what you do in the temporal storybook, the definitive beginning and end of your life here, has a great impact on where your story begins on the other side, beyond the temporal. You see, this world was made to tell you a story that led you there, past the temporal, to what you were meant to be, living in the eternal, never-ending story. But stories that are only based in fiction and lives that are only lived for the book covers don't have a very good beginning nor end here. Beginning of the eternal one having ended so poorly on this side of eternity, and the temporal one. Every story has a plot line, has a plot. And complex plots have convergence. That convergence point is where the story moves towards a climax and a conclusion. Just as it is for the definitive beginning and end of your temporal life here, so too it is for all things here, including what we call the end of the age. For a new story to begin, the old one must reach its climax and its conclusion. That's why our time here in the temporal storybook is so important, because it is where we make our decision for where our story will be after we leave here and enter into the eternal one. In Christendom, we talk about Jesus Christ is the author and finisher of our faith. Our faith transcends temporal things and temporal appearances and circumstances. We are not bound to just the temporal. It is also an acceptance of that, and faith and trust in that being the living Word of God. We are able to become co-authors, co-creators, not only beginning here, but forever after. That's why it's so important that what you choose in the here and now points you towards faith in the eternal forever after. You see, why it is I'm always talking about story, narratives. How are people being misled, deceived, made fearful, confused? Is it not false stories? That's not the author and finisher of our faith. It's the author of fear and confusion, who is the father of lies. And its kingdom is based solely on the book covers and how things appear on the surface. It only writes works of fiction because it wars against all that it is not, which is the truth and love that brings about authentic justice and mercy from humble and contrite hearts. But its stories are always ones of loss, hurt, pain, suffering, destruction, fear and confusion, leading to division and chaos. You see, nothing is hidden here from those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, and a humble and contrite heart, and a willingness to ask. You don't know because you don't ask. You don't ask because you don't seek. And if you have no love for the truth, you care nothing about anything that is deeper than the appearances, which means you're living a lie. You're writing a work of fiction. And you're writing yourself out of the greatest story ever written and into an eternal story of reruns of what you caused, writing a story only of, by, and for the book covers. Is that what you want this nation to be? Is this what you want your life to be? If not, it's time to start writing a different story. I think you need to consider those things. And you need to consider why I'm telling you them right now, at this point of time in human history and in the history of our nation.